Welcome back. Now that I've established myself in a more aesthetically pleasing location and have made some steps towards corralling the undesirables, I can begin working on the meat of this mod pack, which is breaking absolutely everything. The first task on my list is moving my temporary overworld encampment over to my new home. There really isn't much to move, if I'm being honest. The only fully established system I had in the overworld was a fuel cell, and getting that shifted over is as simple as picking it up and moving it. Biofuel generators have enough internal fuel storage to run for about half an hour, so I doubt any of my systems even noticed. The nice thing about the fuel cell design is that once the storage cells are full, it's really easy to start up again. All you have to do is throw a single bioreactor compatible item, in this case a single piece of bone meal, into a pre-configured setup, and the whole thing will spin up from a cold start in like 30 seconds with no additional input required. Once everything's transitioned over, I then spend a healthy chunk of time in the nether, mining out quartz veins. Nether quartz is another one of those random items that has surprisingly few good options for mass production, but unlike a certain green rock, it is used for basically everything AE related, and that combination of hard to automate and easy to use means it's going to be the #1 bottleneck in my expansion for a good long while. With that chore out of the way, for now, let's get started on some production backbone. Something nice and easy, and not terribly transformative, like infinite diamonds, and also coal for reasons. That seems fair and balanced, and not at all likely to break the balancing expectations of other mods. There are two mechanisms of action for this system. The first exploits differences in how Mechanism and Minechem process diamond ore. Mechanism says 1 diamond ore equals 2 diamonds, no takes backsies, whereas Mindchem says 1 diamond ore equals 6 nanotubes, 1 diamond equals 4 nanotubes, and you can trade between the two if you want. Interestingly, this means that Mindchem allows you to dupe diamonds in vanilla as long as you have a fortune enchanted pickaxe, but as Mindchem dupes go, this one is pretty mild. Successfully arbitraging this process produces half a diamond for every diamond ore that you enrich. The coal exchange is a direct conversion that takes diamonds, breaks them down into nanotubes, and then breaks the nanotubes down into carbon, which can then be reassembled into coal. That part isn't a dupe, but it reuses the same molecule, so I like to pair them up. Before I get too deep into this whole process, I should probably preface this video with a warning. I'm going to be setting up a buttload of automated systems. The overwhelming majority of those systems are designed around reprogramming the same handful of machines and modular bits of tech, and rather than explain how everything works every single time, I'm just going to give you a mechanism of action, explain any weirdness I do with a design specific to that one design, and trust that you can figure it out for yourself if you want to automate it on your own. Also, I will be keeping a lovely running tally for each resource Mindchem directly or indirectly lets me dupe, because I need you to understand just exactly how broken this mod is. So let's have 2 dings for diamonds and coal, please. Now that I'm starting to design high-throughput Mindchem systems, I should also explain how you can scale up item extraction from a chemical disassembler. As mentioned earlier, for some reason, chemical disassemblers only allow items to be output one at a time. I have no idea why this is, but it plays merry hell with their throughput when you use ME systems because it forces you to use the single item output mode on your input buses, which is about as fast as a dead postal worker. To get around this, you need an item extraction system that extracts one item at a time, many times very quickly. And this is where Buildcraft comes in. In Buildcraft, item logistics is handled by a bunch of fancy pipes. To get items from an inventory into pipes, you need something called a wooden pipe, which you put next to the inventory having object you want to remove items from. You then normally put down some kind of Buildcraft engine, like a redstone engine, next to that wooden pipe powered up, and the engine powers the pipe to make it extract items. More engines equals faster output, bing bang boom, ghetto item logistics. Except when you think about it for a second, you're gonna realize that there's some interesting implications here. The reason Buildcraft pipes extract items when hooked up to a redstone engine isn't because there's some special interaction between the pipe and the engine. It's because the engine produces and then immediately delivers a single small packet of power to the pipe. You can see this if you hook the engine up to a universal cable to bypass the anti-cheese programming, and then connect that cable up to some sort of energy storage device. Every time the engine pulses, it produces a single Minecraft joule of energy, and this joule of energy is what it costs a wooden pipe to export an item. This implies that wooden transport pipes aren't actually pipes, they're machines that accept Minecraft joules from energy sources, and the fact that their output scales with more engines, which actually means more power, begs an interesting question. It's time to play my most favoritist game. The name of the game is called Does It Stack? The rules, well, I'll let you figure that out for yourself. The answer is yes, obviously, because otherwise why would I be talking about it, but the amount that it stacks is a little bit concerning, even by my OSHA is a myth made so the lizard people can control us standards of workplace safety. In short, 1 joule equals 1 item extracted, no matter what. Wooden pipes are greedy consumers, and they will eat all the power that you give them. I prefer to power them with a redstone energy cell because cells have a nice feature where you can throttle their power output to anywhere from 1 to 100 joules per tick, but they can also connect to universal cable to accept even more than that. Doing this with a cell throttles the pipe down to only a little bit game-breakingly laggy, with the side benefit of not letting them eat your entire fusion reactor's power output to move a single block of dirt. Obligatory PSA, make sure you keep your pipe runs short when you do this, because every item in the pipe is an entity the game has to render, and bad buildcraft setups could kill servers even before they were overclocked at 50,000% speed, so it's safe to say that this tech falls firmly in the category of if you do this on a public server, you will be nuked from orbit. The resulting hodgepodge looks terrible, which should come as absolutely no surprise to anybody who watches any of my videos, but it fits conveniently within a 9x5x5 block space that I allocate for it, and it will produce somewhere on the order of 2.5 diamonds and 2 coal blobs a second for the low price of absolutely nothing until the heat death of the universe. So I consider a bit of aesthetic snarl and obnoxious machine screeching noises to be a fair trade. Unlike the fuel cell design, I don't tend to use full ME systems for these factory bricks. I usually try to just use an ME chest, which also doubles as item storage for intermediary products and a way to accept buildcraft pipe inputs, and then to have that from filling up, I export all the desired outputs into deep storage units with storage buses. Applied Energistics 1 doesn't directly allow subnet access with an interface like AE2 does, but 2 storage buses on a deep storage unit are pretty dang close to that system, and is usually how I handle large-scale factory production. My second factory block is for stone and stone byproducts. Minechem breaks sand down into 16 vials of silicon dioxide, but I can break one of those vials down into 2 oxygen and 1 silicon, which allows me to craft 8 cobblestone. Various smelting and refinement processes applied to the cobblestone can then turn it into stone, gravel, sand, to repeat the loop, glass, and flint. Some of these are far more useful than others, obviously, and I make them available to my Ender Chest network, store them in deep storage units, or in the case of gravel, just cram some in a chest in case I need it. Gravel is not super useful. Speaking of which, my factories don't exchange resources with each other through ME systems. Instead, each factory block is responsible for filling an ender chest of each of the materials it produces. Any factory that needs materials produced by another factory can then subscribe to the outputs of the first factory using the ender chest network. If a factory produces something I intentionally make elsewhere as a byproduct, I can then feed the byproduct back into the source factory that's supposed to be making it, and let the primary producer of that material decide what to do with the excess. Since all the outputs are also buffered with deep storage units, this effectively means any factory block can access the total production output of every factory block without any risk of them clogging or interfering with my main ME system. It's also deafening. Thanks, mechanism. This design pattern has a lot of advantages built in. It's clog-proof, at least until the deep storage units are full, which is not likely to happen. It's incredibly easy to parallelize, and it can provide an absolutely staggering rate of item throughput. It's also something called loosely coupled, which means each factory mostly doesn't care what's going on outside of its own little factory world, which makes modifications and upgrades super easy. Most importantly, however, this system is a novel implementation of a programming paradigm called the publisher-subscriber model, which proves that all of my college education had tangible benefits aside from paying off the mortgage on some executive director's yacht collection. Look, Mom, I'm a real gamer now. You can tell because some old white guy gave me a piece of paper that says, oh, wait, nope, that's a degree. I get those confused sometimes. It turns out that when your factories are 50% redstone by weight, you run out of the stuff pretty quick. I rectify this temporarily with a bit of, manual labor, but this problem is going to require a bit of legwork to permanently resolve. Witches don't spawn globally in this version of the game, which means that I will need to find and farm a witch hut for one, but unlike emeralds and nether quartz, witches are at least a decent scalable option for redstone production. Emeralds and quartz are going to cause problems later. Once I finish slaving away like a little British peasant boy in a coal mine, it's back to automation. My next project is really simple and doesn't revolve around me using Minechem mathematics to spank the game soundly. It's just a bunch of aqueous accumulators, read spontaneous water generators, stuck in a box that suck up water and feed it into some tanks. Not everything has to be complicated, after all. Using this fresh source of water, I then make another factory block that doesn't require Minechem. Amazing! This one instead feeds the energy from a massively oversized power core into a bunch of lava generators, and then feeds the lava from those directly into igneous extruders to produce scads upon scads of obsidian. Well, it will, once the power core spools up, that is. My biofuel cell is starting to struggle a bit, especially when it comes to saturating new power cores. I should technically be more than okay to keep using the old setup, but it is probably time for me to upgrade it with a new pub sub model, because I have the resources and it is being real slow. And that looks like this. What's actually going on here is that I split the old biofuel cell into two components. The first specializes in only making pink dye, but it does that as fast as possible, which is it's very fast. And it's running at like a third of its nominal production speed right now. That pink dye gets buffered and, air quotes, published to the Ender Chest network, and this fuel cell subscribes to the pink dye frequency to keep its itty-bitty little ME system topped up and exporting to the bioreactors. Now, if for some reason I ever need more biofuel, I can just create another subscriber to the pink dye network rather than making an entire new system. Isn't modularity fun? Oh, and I'm not bothering with the white or red dye anymore because it's too much of a pain to automate. And pretty quickly here, we're going to be getting rid of this paradigm entirely, so whatever. I should still probably add pink dye to the dupe counter, though. This next factory block makes blaze rods. Amazingly, it too doesn't use Minechem, and instead relies on a generous 1:4 rod-to-powder conversion ratio given to me by thermal expansion pulverizers. The process also produces sulfur, but since thermal expansion sulfur is useless on its own and can only be crafted into gunpowder, I opt to just dump all of it instead of storing it. Great! I now have a functionally limitless source of a bunch of things that nobody cares about, and also flint. With a bit of minium stone usage, I can actually transform most of the stuff into even more stuff that I can't be bothered to list, so the amount of material that I can potentially produce is quite substantial. This is lovely and all, but those materials on their own aren't going to be terribly useful in a vacuum, and their automation process is boring and uncreative to the point where I consider dupe loops for them to be as much part of my basic infrastructure as item storage and power is. So, now what? Well, now we get into the really interesting things to automate. In particular, the generation of exotic ore types. For the record, for every ore in the game, I could easily solve this problem by spamming out mining lasers from Mine Factory Reloaded. They suck power worse than a vacuum in a wind tunnel and are about as fast as a bag of dry slugs, but they are also cheap, easy to spam in bulk, and require next to no automation to get working at any scale you care to name. The best explanation I can give as to why I'm not using the easy and obvious solution that otherwise may as well have property of neurotic goose tattooed onto its rear end is that it's so easy that it just doesn't really appeal to me. There isn't any artistry in spamming out a bunch of junk and calling it a solution. That's New Horizons level gameplay. It does, however, work really, really well, so if you're playing this game on your own, just use the lasers, seriously. I make the game way harder for myself than it needs to be out of some weird mix of self-loathing, masochism, and novelty-seeking, and I will not judge you for taking the obviously correct solution. I, however, am built different, and not in a good way, and as such, instead of rolling on infinite free resources, I am liquefying my backdoor bakery by sprinting all over Notch's green Minecraft looking for a witch hut. Without exploiting cheese or mining lasers, there really isn't any other good way of producing redstone, which means that I'm going to be extracting it from the local wildlife for the foreseeable future. Fortunately for me, the local wildlife in question is witches, a mob that in this version of Minecraft spawns only in witch huts. Whee! Field trip time. In this version of the game, swamps are about as common as dirt, so getting one of the huts isn't a problem. I was going to launch into a whole explanation of how witches spawn and how I have the technology to make a really strong vanilla witch farm using all my modded tools, but the instant I turned my back on the thing, a couple witches spawned in it, so that worked. One Pokeball later, and my mission is complete. Of course, to get a soul shard for witches, I need to kill 1024 of the things, which needs mob juice, which needs another soul shard based farm, because how else am I going to do it right now? To the best of my knowledge, there is no way of salvaging a soul shard once placed in a soul cage, which means one thing and one thing only. It's time to make another withdrawal from my good friend, the End Dimension. Did somebody order an industrial quantity of blue balls? I mean ender pearls? I sure didn't, but I got them anyway. Once my new shard is done, I shove it into basically a carbon copy of the old setup I was using for villagers, but this time in my new dimension with some added aesthetic features like not making it out of literal dirt. All the juice gets pumped into auto spawners, the auto spawners spawn witches, I stab the witches to make a soul shard, and everyone is happy. Except for the endermen and the witches. And I take that back. Actually, nobody is happy. The Endermen are dead, the witches are stuck in a hole chain potioning each other into oblivion, and I have carpal tunnel. These are what's known in the field as implementation issues. And implementation issues aside, the end result works just fine. It's a box that spawns witches, and then kills them. If I ever need more witches, I can add more witch soul shards, and I will no doubt end up doing that at some point down the line. There's nothing complicated about it, it's just a mob farm. I will come back later and slam in some cabling to storage bus it up into my main system so I can pull resources from it directly, but other than that, it will quite happily run in the background for the rest of the series, cranking out industrial quantities of redstone and all the other things that witches drop that I can't be bothered to remember. So, redstone solved. Now for the rest of them. And yeah. There really aren't any other good ways that don't involve Minecam. So, fine. I tried. YouTube as my witness, I tried to do things the fair and balanced and reasonable way. You remember when I was talking about how automated farming was surprisingly difficult to pull off in this version of Minecraft? Yeah, I lied. Minefactory Reloaded has a pair of machines called a planter and a harvester that can pull it off just fine, as long as you ignore the planter's habits of duping literally everything that you put in it, and turtles can accomplish pretty much the same thing for free with less duping if you have some familiarity with programming. The real problem with farming is that, last I checked, plants aren't ore, which is where Minecam comes in. As previously mentioned, the dye flowers can be crafted into seeds, which can then be planted to produce more dye flowers. This is literally episode 1, minute 1 tech right here. Light blue dye, episode 2, decomposes into 1 vial of copper sulfate. Copper sulfate decomposes into 1 vial of sulfate ions, because that makes sense, and 1 vial of elemental copper. 16 vials of elemental copper can be turned into 1 copper dust. Huzzah, we have turned flowers into copper. Normally, the 33% return rate on vials and ridiculous exchange rate of 16 dye per ingot of copper would make this expensive, time-consuming, and heroically inefficient. Fortunately for me, I have infinite vials thanks to another Minecam loot that produces glass, which means the only limiting factor is how fast I can make blue dye. Which, you will be shocked to hear, is alarmingly fast. This particular brand of ear torture is brought to you by the power of bone meal bags not getting consumed by flowers, and the sentence, "while true do turtle.placedown end," which is turtle speak for "you are now become auto-clicker." It turns out that when you install 9 turtle auto-clickers equipped with a mix of seeds and bone meal bags in the general proximity of a few too many Mine Factory reloaded harvesters, you get a machine that looks and sounds like you're stuffing a Mardi Gras celebration through an industrial wood chipper with a die output to match. That's nice. I'll take 2, please. Once I have a source of light blue dye and more ear torture than any sane avian individual would ever wish to experience in their lifetime, the rest is easy. Bulk chemical decomposition and assembly is a solved problem for my automation tech, so all I need to do is cram together a Minechem processing line with extra disassemblers, give it a heroically oversized power cell to account for the weirdly energy-intensive process of making copper dust out of what is presumably copper dust in tubes, and then subscribe the whole system to the trash, light blue dye, and glass vial ender chest networks. At 2 or 3 dusts a second, its production rate is pretty terrible by the standards of some of my other playthroughs, but for this mod pack, 2 or 3 copper a second is kind of ridiculous. I'm not entirely sure if you want to call this a Minechem dupe, but it certainly is Minechem enabled, so we'll add a ding for it anyway. But wait, we aren't done just yet. Now that I have infinite copper, I can do other fun things. Minechem can break down Mechanism's bronze ingots into 4 vials of tin and 12 vials of copper, which, at a 1:3 ratio of tin to copper, is pretty standardized across all mod packs, and is therefore kind of useless. Unless you're Mechanism, in which case, you decided that instead of continuing to use a ratio of tin to copper that has been around since the literal Bronze Age, you would be a maverick and use a ratio of 1:5. When combined with Minechem and a bit of math, this means I can convert copper into tin with 83% efficiency, because reasons. Let's add bronze and tin to that list of Minechem-enabled dupes, shall we? One last factory, well, for now, that is. It's a dedicated lapis production system that uses the same tech as my light blue dye factory with some swapped out seeds. Lapis is almost entirely useless in this pack, but it can be burned in an Emphis coercion deriver to massively increase the amount of Fortron generated for a short period of time. Given that I can make infinite lapis, this massive temporary increase can quite easily be turned into a massive permanent one, which, as you can imagine, helps quite a lot with the efficiency of my Fortron power cores. Speaking of which, I need one of those. Badly. My hack-together core has been enough to mostly keep the mobs off my back, but I can't run the force field system while the interdiction matrix is up, and the matrix isn't strong enough to cover more than maybe a quarter of my factory. I've been lucky so far in that the few creepers that popped off didn't destroy anything irreplaceable, but mobs are a serious concern now that I'm expanding further and further away from the interdicted safe zone. As with every system, my force field core design starts with a giant power cell. From the cell extend 4 different wires, and on each of those wires I attach 4 coercion derivers each, all of them fed with lapis from the Ender Chest network. And after a quick save and world backup, I can then start placing down Ender tanks and fluiducts. It's a bit hard to see, but there are actually 4 different Ender Chest frequencies in play here. The reason for this is entirely related to a trade-off with load balancing and throughput. Less frequencies mean better load balancing, but for high-power applications, the Fortron demand is high enough that a single network can't keep up. I've never needed more than 4 frequencies before, but the interdiction area for my base is about half again as large as the biggest of the systems I ever made before this series, so we will have to see how well that holds up. Interestingly, this completed Fortron core is so powerful that it actually raises an unexpected problem in the form of my Fortron provisioning speed. I can produce the stuff like there's no tomorrow, but extracting it from the derivers and cramming it into an interdiction matrix or a field generator is the new bottleneck. There are only so many sides to a cube after all, and fluid ducts are as fast as it gets for fluid transport, so we're going to need a new Fortron supply paradigm. The solution here is obviously use the intended mechanic of Fortron capacitors to do it. The capacitors are wireless after all, and without having coercion derivers in the mix, you can just tell them to drain all of their power forever, which inevitably means it will go to the only block on the network that can actually consume it. In the early game, they are pretty terrible when compared to just pumping this stuff manually, but if you happen to have an infinite source of diamonds, redstone, and steel, you can just crank out 3 stacks of speed upgrades, cram those in, and all of a sudden capacitors are viable again. You will run out of upgrade slots on your interdiction matrix long before you can outscale capacitor spam, so that problem is now solved forever. Now, I could apply this solution normally, and just create a death blob of capacitors and ender tanks. Fully upgraded capacitors are strong enough that the aux power system for a maxed out interdiction matrix would not take up more than like a 3-block cube of space, which is nothing in this mod pack. My water pump takes up more space than that. But why would I do that when I can instead do this? Emphas, in addition to being utterly broken mechanically, happens to have a really cool decorative effect when power is sent between devices. Sure, it isn't a particularly efficient use of my time, but I am 3 inches and a dupe glitch away from creative mode at this point, so why not have a little fun with blue raspberry flavored radioactive death lasers and way more trigonometry than should ever be needed in a game that revolves around cubes. At least that was the idea. The unfortunate reality is that Emphas really doesn't want to cooperate when it comes to doing really cool things with laser light shows, probably because some twit wanted to optimize for boring things like game performance instead. Once I realized that, I went ahead and scaled down to what I actually needed to run the thing, which was this. It's not very impressive looking, but it's also probably less laggy, or something. So much for heckin' cool design plans, right? If you were wondering, yes, if I wanted to extract more Fortron out of my Fortron core, I could use this exact same solution in reverse, but I legitimately don't even know if it's possible to use that much Fortron. Like, my matrix is interdicting out to the world render limit, and the Fortron core is using so little of its production capacity right now that it might as well be a rounding error. Well, if I'm not using it for interdiction, then that extra Fortron core capacity does have another fun use. Turbo-scuffed power generation. Coercion drivers can be run in reverse to produce electricity with Fortron, and they convert it at a really decent output rate if you use the right kind of cable. A coercion driver on integrate mode produces substantially more power than a biofuel generator, even, which means that Fortron-fueled coercion integrator power cores are way more space efficient than biofuel-fueled biogenerator cores.
Wait, what?
So if you ever need to produce a buttload of power in a really small amount of space, the former is actually better. In a perfect example of mod compatibility jank, this mechanic only works when you're using universal cable because the coercion driver self-throttles when it's fed power in the form of Minecraft joules, and the throttling rate is so steep that you will end up deleting energy for no reason. But I use universal cable for pretty much everything anyway because they have higher throughput, so that part is largely unchanged. The scuffed part of the turbo-scuffed power generation comes from the conversion ratios. Using universal cable to up the power feed rate, I have here 100,000 Minecraft joules worth of power that's been converted into Fortron using 6 pieces of lapis as a catalyst. Converting that Fortron back into power then nets me an excess of 434,000 Minecraft joules, which means that I'm burning lapis at around 72,000 joules per piece. This is an astonishingly good return rate. Even at maximum efficiency, a biofuel generator would only be able to extract 25,600 joules worth of power per piece of lapis, and that would require 8 other different materials to correctly catalyze the reaction. Oh wait, I'm sorry, did I say this was the scuffed part? No, this isn't the scuffed part. The scuffed part is that you can also just ignore the lapis part entirely and convert power into more power at around a 1 to 3 exchange rate, which really kind of makes the lapis optional. It also means that I'm now using Fortron to dupe power. From this, I conclude that the only reason this pack was ever balanced and playable on any kind of multiplayer server ever was because none of the people who played it thought to ask any of the obvious questions. Because if I were playing this on a server now, that server would be toast in under a week. As broken as this is, I am switching over to using Fortron power mostly for the utility of it. I already have infinite power, after all, so nothing really changes there. Dye production at any scale I care to implement is now a solved problem, and biofuel systems are cheap enough and scalable enough that unless I find an entirely new energy consumption paradigm, I will be able to just build them bigger to meet any demand I can run into. The real benefit of these systems is that coercion drivers can accept Fortron wirelessly. This means that I no longer have to worry about physically pumping a fluid into the generation area, which means I can roughly double the amount of power I can make out of any given space. As an added bonus, getting rid of all the fluid pipes should hopefully help make a dent in the lag that my base is producing. My game is not quite unplayable yet, but I can definitely tell that the frame rate is starting to tank, and we haven't even done anything super interesting yet. In fact, the lag is already so bad that I've started redesigning my base to deal with it. A lot of my dedicated production systems can be removed at this point. For example, I will never find a use for 300,000 blaze rods, and I highly doubt that there's any point to making more, so that system can probably go away. The big performance gains actually come from upgrading my central Fortron core and then switching over to Fortron Energy entirely. The old temporary core is probably where most of the lag is coming from in the first place, so finishing that project will let me scrap the old core along with the rest of my biofuel production as an added bonus. All this better engineering is great, but it is also a short-term solution to an unsolved long-term problem. And that problem is that universal cable eats frames like a starving hippo. For some systems, like my Fortron core, it is utterly essential to the function of the machine, because there is simply no other way to duplicate Fortron. But most of my designs could be run on comparatively frame-sipping redstone energy conduits instead. Unfortunately, supplying power from coercion drivers using Minecraft Joule-carrying redstone energy conduits is about as effective as filling a tanker truck with a pipette, which means I need a non-universal cable method of wiring up coercion drivers and then converting and transporting the power before it gets dumped into those conduits. The only way to do that, at scale, is with a block called an Ultimate Energy Cube, which, with a price tag of 26 ingots of osmium apiece, is roughly 100 times more expensive than my current cabling. Ouch. I, obviously, do not have a hope of producing that much osmium yet, and replumbing even one of my factories with this tech would completely bankrupt me. The only solution I know of to mass-produce osmium is idiotic in the extreme and will require more time to explain than I have today, though, so it will have to wait until the next episode. Thank you for your time. If you haven't already, I would love to have you help me implement our own little publisher subscriber model using the YouTube buttons down below, and I hope you enjoyed.